Visionary. By Douglas Milewski. Elemental P. United States. Copyright 2016 by Douglas Milewski. All rights reserved. Chapter 4. Why did people hate wizards? There was nothing sudden about it. Think of wizards as lawyers who can bend reality. Some people always hated wizards, some people hated what wizards stood for, but most people hated us because wizards represented the sharks at the top of the food chain. For better or for worse, we became scapegoats of a terribly corrupt government system. They didn't hate us personally, or hate us if we worked for them, but generally there was hate. The Great War ended with King George V's forced abdication, the Kaiser replacing him with Queen Louise. As part of the armistice, Britain was forced to hand over her possessions and territories, while crushing reparations were assigned to everybody. Independence, that hopeless principle which the colonies had rebelled for over and over again, had finally come to pass. The colonies were now the free states with a free people and a staggering debt. Given the chance to seize power and rule this new nation for their own benefit, a coalition of plutocrats, politicians, the Catholic Church, and wizards did so. The people disagreed, this time with machine guns. Our officials were held responsible for the economic crash after the war. The communists, the unions, and the Protestant churches made an unholy alliance, and from there came the successful Easter Uprising of 1920, which replaced one corrupt coalition with another. The public hated them too, but the military hated them worse. The nasty thing about politics is that revenge happens. People don't just want to even the score, they want Old Testament payback sevenfold. The plutocracy and the politicians knew how to hold their own while the Catholics knew how to head back to being downtrodden, but the wizards never understood that their own allies were more treacherous than their enemies, so they managed to get themselves thrown under a freight train. Down south, the wizards quickly found burning crosses on their lawns, and soon after that the lynchings began. In half the country, wizards were open season. My fellow wizards had callously sown the seeds of ill will and added fertilizer copiously. The public revenge upon them was so entertaining that the people forgot about the plutocrats and the politicians. That was a good tactic. Diversions work. The law took up what the vigilantes began. The North may have only passed laws and set the church on the blasphemers, but the violence and hatred were no less. By now the papers, which had lambasted the wizards, tarring them with reputations far worse than they had earned, had whipped the public into a frenzy. What had begun as a case of political bullying and kicking the loser, turned into a glass whirlwind shredding its way across society. If you were a reasonable wizard, you fled the country or hid yourself away. It was more complicated than that, of course. Human affairs always are. I didn't have time to follow them. Already having changed my name and disappeared into the mass of humanity, the wave of hatred thrown at my fellows missed me, but not without me having to dive out of the way a few times. The plutocracy and the disfavored churches also fared poorly, but not so poorly as the wizards. Anti-Catholic laws on the wane during the Empire resurged in the States. Catholics were already used to this, so they ducked their heads well. Meanwhile, the communists pushed through laws allowing the nationalization of some businesses and the confiscation of property, but the actual application was left up to the bureaucracy, which succumbed to capitalistic bribery. I wasn't the only wizard to duck his head and make a new life for himself. Luke Mather had also made the transition to ordinary person. I have no idea how that ancient codger managed to stay ahead of old age, let alone the barbarous crowd, but he did so with grace. I met him last autumn as I went for a walk. Over on Creek Street, I passed a church that had taken fire damage. I later learned that Fiat Lux had poured gasoline in the chapel and lit it on fire, so now the congregation was busily repairing the building themselves. There I saw Luke Mather ordering young men about, looking about 1,000,000 years older than Methuselah. His was a face that I had never expected to see again. When I was admitted to Ivy Hall, my grandmother had hired Luke Mather to tutor me and get my non-existent magic up to snuff. By reputation, his skills were considered the best out there, regularly bringing home prizes from competitions. By all measures he should have been a professor, but he had become a Swedenborgian, and officially, though not in practice, only Anglicans could teach at or attend Ivy Hall. Unwilling to lie in order to obtain a post, he had made his living tutoring young men who preferred drinking and football games. In this way he wound up making more money than most of the staff, but considering how poorly university staff were paid, that wasn't difficult. The church that burned was Swedenborgian. Even after 8 years of independence, Fiat Lux was still determined to set their rage against their perceived enemies, which was everyone who wasn't Catholic and everyone who cooperated with the government. That made their list of enemies rather large. For some reason Fiat Lux had a beef with Swedenborgians, which never made sense to me as nobody ever had a beef with the Swedenborgians, but then again Fiat Lux's anarchism never made any sense. They were like that girl you used to know who took offense at everything and insisted that you knew the reason. When I saw him again, Luke looked and sounded like the proverbial old man of the mountain, somehow hauled back into civilization with a team of horses and a steam engine. Like an old wild child, he counted the days until he could kick off his shoes and unbutton his collar. Despite his age, you couldn't underestimate him. A football player once tripped him just for spite, so Luke gave him a walloping so thorough that it made the school paper. Old Man Mather didn't fight fair, and didn't turn the other cheek as easily as he should. So when I had entered that churchyard, Luke had given me a long stare, unsure of whether to bolt or surrender. I still hadn't been sure it was him with his shaggy, receded hair. To show that I meant no harm, I extended my hand. "Could you use some help? I'm handy and learn fast." Luke had nodded at that, looking about just to make sure that no one was around, then had offered his hand. "Luke Alderman." "John Johnson," I said, shaking his hand. Past that introduction, we both never said a word about our past. There was no need. Our afternoons together were all about sawing wood and fitting boards. There was a directness to this construction that I needed, and as best I could tell, a simplicity that Luke needed as well. At first it may seem like the exact opposite of magic, but measuring and cutting wood accurately used many of the same geometric skills. Drafting was equally useful with magical drawings as it was with carpentry. Assembly took time and attention. That much said, after meeting him the first time, I began spending my Saturdays in the churchyard with Luke. That kept me busy, well away from the house filled with bored women, and well away from my landlady who confused me with slave labor. This particular Saturday, we were busy rebuilding the vestibule, which was more difficult than I normally would attempt, but Luke was comfortable with the project and preached at me as I worked. The Lord is like a king, and we are like his uppity knight, a sinner who is interested in the king's beautiful daughter Grace. When we step out of place attempting to win grace for ourselves, the Lord sends us away. Grace is lost to us. Only when we've found the king's missing heirs, those who will truly inherit his kingdom, can we marry his beloved daughter. Those heirs are his greatest commandments: love thy God and love thy neighbor. I don't remember Emanuel Swedenborg ever saying anything like that, but that's why I like spending time with Luke. He liked putting things together in his head, making what should be unapproachable easy to grasp. That he took up magic was a crime. The man was a theologian in his heart, but such a one that no proper church would have him. Perhaps it was best that he had lived so many years in the God-forsaken interior, where only the Red Indian dared to live. So who is the devil? I asked, feeling myself too clever. Luke slapped his Bible against the door, rattling the doorknobs. The devil is your friend who tries to seduce Grace away from you. He'll lie to you. He'll say that he's seen your love's fair breast, true only because of subterfuge you can be sure. He'll show you the token of her affection which he stole. The devil wants to drive a wedge between you and Grace, for he wants Grace for himself, a thing which he is now denied. He was the first angel made, it is said, and he has never forgotten receiving all of God's infinite grace, and he will do anything to get it all back. Without it he despairs. Yet Grace is no fool. She will not be kidnapped. She will not be gained through subterfuge. She will hide herself away quite cleverly, so finding Grace requires that you search, although she may not appear how you expect or where you expect. That seemed like a good place to ask the next question. And what happens when I reject the devil? Luke tapped his Bible on his breast. Then surely you shall find friends in strange places. With these friends you shall again appear before the Lord, and only then shall Grace reveal herself. In truth she was among your company all along, and those strange companions proved to be the king's heirs. When the king sees all present and his commandments are returned to him, then he will give his grace to you body and soul, and she will throw herself willingly into your arms. I always enjoyed stories like that from him. They made me a bit happier than I normally would be. I met a girl, I told Luke. Pretty? Pretty to me. Smart. Clever. A bit cold sometimes, but responsible. Comfortable. She sounds like a keeper, but you can't trust those keepers. They're tender traps, my friend. Tender traps, and they let you trap yourself. Women don't have your interest at heart when they smile at you. You are merely a means to that end. Don't let yourself get comfortable. Get yourself an Indian woman instead. That's a bit cynical. I was not naive, but that statement was more jaded than I was prepared to believe. Luke tucked his Bible behind his back as if to protect it from his own words. I've been married long enough to know the truth of it. Twice even. Second time was no better than the first. But you make your choices and you live with them. That's the nature of marriage. Living by yourself hand to mouth is far worse than the tender trap. A man needs a woman at home to give him reason to labor hard all day, and a daughter to give it all meaning. If not, we'd all just work hard enough to get our daily ale and a bit of bread. Where would the world be then? You work hard now, I retorted. The Bible came back out. That's because I work for God. I married the church, and she's no better than any of those other women out there. By that I mean the real church, full of real men and women who argue about which shade of red to use at Pentecost, not this fairy idea of a church that is holier than thou. As I said, young man, you make your choices and live by them. I only need my bread and ale so the rest of my love can go to him. I adored Luke. I could never have made that answer up. But for having the wrong religion, Luke would have had a high seat at the Ivy Hall Tacitum. Even if he had merely pretended to be an Anglican, Ivy Hall would have hired him. There were well-known Catholics, Lutherans, and Methodists among the faculty giving their lip service to the official doctrine. As long as you answered Anglican, Ivy Hall didn't care. Its due diligence began and ended with the mutually believed lie. Luke could not even abide that small a lie. He lived his true faith or he lived nothing. I admire that level of commitment. Few men can live like that. As for mentioning that Cymbeline was a theosopher, I kept that to myself. I spent as long as I could helping Luke, but had to knock off halfway through the afternoon to get ready for the party. I had no desire to go. I dreaded it. I am not a creature of small talk and boisterous rooms. When needed, I could put on a fair enough face and entertain those around me, but that was all show. I was merely vamping until I could fish out a decent conversation, if such a conversation could be found. A letter was waiting for me when I got home. The handwriting was fluid and beautiful in its flowing arcs. It smelled a little of something, but I could not identify it. The letter was from Cymbeline. Luke had tried to warn me. Dear Jack, how wonderful it was to spend the afternoon with you, and how delighted I will be when I spend next Thursday with you as well. Baroness Paget has given me the afternoon off, so there will be more time for lunch. I look forward to seeing you again at the hot dog stand. Do be there. I would be so disappointed if you didn't show. Yours truly, Cymbeline. That woman sure did know how to put out the bait. I would gladly put my head under that mousetrap and eat the cheese. I know that sounds impulsive, having only just met her, but I had met few women who had made such an impression upon me. I could not yet articulate her worth, but I recognized her value. Had I really met her before? I wish that I could remember, but that memory had turned cold. Joe and Charlie picked me up at 5 o'clock sharp, bringing the new suit with them. I changed in the car as they drove through Rowland Hill, past the end of the trolley line, to where the big houses and the golf clubs grew rampant as weeds. Past there we drove along a gravel road for half a mile, turning onto a large property with a sprawling house. Yes, that Baroness was quite the rich woman. After all the confiscation of property that had happened over the last few years, she still had all this. This meant that her family was very well connected. The driveway full of cars told me that this would be a rich party, if not sumptuous. At a minimum, it would be impeccably dressed. Joe brought me into the house through the back porch where the drivers were busy drinking beer and eating pork and beans, then through the kitchen where the negress cook gave Joe a stern look. "Where's my pie?" she demanded, knowing full well who had done the deed. "I'll look for it," replied Joe, thinking nothing of the pie that he had stolen. "God help you." Not even bothering to slow, Joe gently pushed through the throngs chatting in the house, past the concert pianist tinkling away on some beautiful and complicated tune, stopping at an ordinary door. "Ma'am," he knocked, "Jack's here." Hearing a response, he called me forward. "Go in and be polite. Don't make me not like you." I didn't like how he said those words. I had no doubt that his friendship would evaporate like ether the moment that I crossed his employer. Well-dressed and well-rounded, the Baroness Paget stood for me as I entered her small sitting room, a fire ensuring a certain coziness. Calling the place a sitting room would be generous on my part. It was really a library disguised as a sitting room. By my quick scrutiny, she had every book that Blavatsky ever wrote on theosophy. Right next to them was a pile of my stories. I shook her gloved hand. She smiled back at me with such delightful eyes, squeezing my hand gently in return. "Mr. Johnson, I am so very glad that you came. Cymbeline has such nice things to say about you. Please sit with me." Joe closed the door, leaving us alone. I waited for the Baroness to sit, then I sat myself in a seat upholstered with a bold flower print. That seat did its best to relax me, pulling me in gently. It whispered in my ear, tempting me with a cigar, a Bloody Mary, and long arguments over esoteric theories. In that chair, I would get everything that I ever wanted, and that made me a wary man. Mr. Johnson, Joe also tells me wonderful things about you. I am so very piqued by interesting men. I understand that you wrote these stories. Yes, I responded matter-of-factly, keeping my eyes upon her face or earrings rather than on her tastefully low neckline. I did write the stories. They aren't much. The Baroness did smile so nicely. Even being 20 years older than me, she seemed a tender trap. That's what interests me, Mr. Johnson. They aren't much at all, but they are entertaining. I had asked for interesting submissions from my editors, tales with certain potential, and yours was one of them. I sent Joe out to speak with you and bring me more. Having read them, I agree, yours are interesting, so I have a proposition for you. I come from a wealthy and respectable family, a status which has allowed me to learn and study theosophy, a luxury not afforded the common man. Unfortunately, as the fate of wizards in our society has declined, so too has theosophy. I find that situation unacceptable. Do you understand me so far? I do. Do you have any objections to theosophy? I don't believe in it, if that's what you mean. No more than that? No more. Then I should explain more. In normal times, I think that the hatred for wizards would have wilted by now, but fiat lux with their anarchistic ways have fanned the flames of hatred by being so terrible themselves. The public, so often ignorant, doesn't know the difference between theosophy and wizardry. It is my intention to change public opinion about both theosophy and wizardry, to present people with a new narrative, to diffuse this bomb that fiat lux has planted among our hearts. I need your help to do that. What I want is to publish stories about theosophists, engaging enough to get people enchanted by the study, like cowboys or gangsters, but clever enough that the censors accept those stories as written. I want them to be subversive. I want the people to learn that theosophists are the new wizards, moral wizards. Maybe through building interest we can build a new generation of wizards, a colonial generation built on theosophical values, and so restore magic to its proper grace. The only thing that I lack in this plan is a narrator. Up to this point, I was unsure whether she had recognized me or been told by Cymbeline, but now, after examining her eyes, I could see that she thought of me as a writer and nothing more, so I chose to play the doubter card. As I said, I don't believe. If you'll excuse my bluntness, theosophy seems like more of the same. What more is there? The woman placed her gloved fingers aside her clever eyes. Do you think that all the magic that we see is all that there is? Magic is like music. You think that you've heard it all, and then some composer takes everything that you know and makes something new with it, just like Gershwin did. Have you ever heard Gershwin? Have you heard any of the new composers? All of our previous geniuses are lost. In and among the young, I am sure that there will appear the next Beethoven or Mozart, some new genius, so to speak. If I am to leave anything to this world, then leaving something new would be a marvelous thing. The fusion of wizardry and theosophy will make this century the most peaceful ever. What else are we to do with money if not make this world a better place for all? That indeed. Yet the basic questions remained. Even if we do succeed, then what? How can you create a new fusion without wizards? The Baroness frowned at that, and I felt very sorry to see her frown. I don't know, Mr. Johnson. Hopefully we can tempt our expatriates back as we turn the tide on petty human resentments. We colonials are nothing if not topical. I believe that people have grown tired of all this revolutionary zeal and want a new fashion. They want an excuse. The sooner that these fearful emotions end, the better off everyone will be. I shook my head, not agreeing. I think that this is a fool's errand, with me being the fool. I surely expected that woman to take offense at my tone of voice, but she proved her station at that moment. The Baroness folded her hands onto her lap, considering, then spoke. Mr. Johnson, you do not know me very well, so I will forgive you for this. I have a sharp eye for talent. As you can see by my employees, I like to pick up strays, people without real homes, and give them homes. I turn them around and point them where they need to go. A stable home is the foundation of all virtue. That is what I excel at. It is a skill that I learned from Blavatsky. When you walked into the room, I knew that you were one such spirit. There's an energy to you, a vibration that is pleasing and strong. I like it. I have full faith that you will do great good with your writing if only it is pointed in the right direction. My offer is this: write what you will. If I find your stories acceptable, I will see to it that they get published in my boys' adventure magazines. The censors won't touch a word of them, I guarantee. If I can't get them by the censors, I will get them into one of my bootleg presses. I will pay you generously per word, adjusted for inflation. Write as little or as much as you please. You will be my personal poet, as it were, or my hermit, if you please. I shook my head. I did not want any of this, so I stood to leave. I am very sorry. I am not comfortable with this. I should go. She stood, holding out her hand, shaking mine again with no animosity, her chubby smile beaming with disarming charm. Consider, Mr. Johnson. I do not need an answer today. My door is always open to you, but opportunity is not so patient as I am. I will have my rider. I exited the Baroness's quiet sitting room, immediately regretting leaving that cozy space. All those people packed into the house filled me with black pain. There were so many strange faces, and all the voices were speaking at once, garbling each other in the process, even while my head swam with the Baroness's offer. It was like those school receptions all over again, filling me with despair. So I did what always worked. I walked towards the buffet. A pair of Negro men in white coats, as light-skinned as you could hire, politely set small portions onto small dishes. "John," said a feminine voice behind me. I turned to see Cymbeline standing up from the piano. She walked up to me and took my arm, speaking musically. "What are you doing here? Did Joe bring you?" "He shouldn't have. He just can't leave well enough alone." "Have you eaten?" I patted her hand, still hot from playing the piano. "I'm the help, John. I don't eat here." I didn't like that answer. "Then where do you eat?" "I'm sure that it's better than here. I'll get a little more on my plate, enough for both of us. They can't say no to a guest." "And that was lovely playing. I didn't know that you played." Cymbeline rolled her eyes. "My playing was terrible. The piano sounded just awful. I just wish I could find a proper piano for the Baroness, but you just can't get them imported these days." I had the Negroes assemble her a cold plate, then she showed me back through the house and up the servants' staircase. We wound up sitting on the floor of a nursery, the toys long ago put away onto shelves and never disturbed again. Between us sat a child's table. "Do you live here? Are you one of the servants?" "Yes," said Cymbeline. "I told you I'm her social secretary." "I did say that, didn't I? I also live with Joe and Charlie in town. They are such dears. Baroness Paget owns an apartment building where she lets us have a room. She's always taking in people and getting them back on their feet. She is such a Christian woman. On some weeks we get nobody. Some days she binges, and the hopeless just don't stop walking through that door. She's a good woman. She's a very good woman." I thought it best to explain my meeting with her boss. She gave me a job offer. "Oh, that's wonderful." From the look in her eyes, I could see that she truly did think this offer was wonderful. I still wasn't convinced. "Is it? I'm not sure that I want it. She wants me to write stories for her. The last thing I want is some church inspector wondering who I am. I'm one step away from Judas Iscariot prison as it is, and that's assuming that I make it to trial." Cymbeline squeezed my hand. "You're a wonderful writer. I remember the clever little pieces that you used to write for the fan magazines. My roomie used to read them out loud to me. I'm sure that you can write whatever you put your mind to." I wasn't so confident. "The Baroness wants me to write about theosophy. How can I do that? Wizards and theosophists are like cats and dogs. We don't go together. I'm done with that world. I won't go back." "Then why didn't you say no? Why didn't you walk out the front door? Charlie would have taken you home." I accepted her challenge. "Because you're here. I would have left right after eating if it wasn't for you." Cymbeline smiled at that. She cast her gaze aside just for a second before turning her head back. "Will you do me a favor? Will you trust the Baroness? Just a little? Give her a story. Is that too much to ask? Given a little time, you will discover what a wonderful woman she is." I was a damned fool in that instant. For her I would play the fool. I'll give her a story.